Chapter 12 3 hours before integration. 2 days had passed since his confrontation with Chrysalis. Although she had promised change, life in the Hive remained pretty much the same. They worked, they farmed, they kept watch for intruders, and they harvested love from the sleeping ponies. Caramel had to rein himself in several times throughout, telling himself that it was unreasonable to expect Chrysalis to tell everyone to stop feeding on them immediately. Without a guaranteed sustainable source of food, they'd be in a lot of trouble before long. But that didn't make it any easier to stomach the notion of leeching off on them, even if the Queen had ordered everyone to be gentler about it. Stealing was stealing, and he didn't think that would sit very well with any pony they tried to make contact with. The Queen was still looking into their options for diplomacy. The other thing that kept itching at the back of his mind was Princess Luna. He still had vivid dreams, but the moon was no longer present in them, and neither was the dark alicorn. At least, not directly. Whilst wandering through the barren landscapes in his dreams, he always felt like he was being watched, and although it did not affect the restfulness of his sleep, it bothered him when he was awake. He still hadn't told anyone else about the princess, partially because he wasn't sure how Chrysalis was going to react to that information, and also partially because he suspected that she was going to think him incredibly stupid for thinking that finding the moon would have helped him in his cause, no matter how uncannily vivid his dreams were. After he was done with his duties for the day in the hatchery, he made his way to the repository to meet up with Sash. It was a chance for him to watch her work and learn a little more about what was involved in looking after the pods and their occupants. It was also a chance for him to keep an eye on his friends. Although he wasn't in any position to change their situation yet, he still felt like he owed them something for getting them tangled in this mess in the first place. Making sure that nothing worse happened to them was the least he could do. But all thoughts of his captured friends vanished when he found Sash presiding over 2 pods that he was pretty sure had never been in that part of the chamber before. Her warm greeting went unanswered as he cantered right up to the pods and stared at them. Sash tapped him on the shoulder and said,
I can explain.
I sure hope so. The 2 pods had resin that was a light, glossy shade of green, unlike the darker hue of the rest of them. And he did not recognize the 2 ponies inside. He rounded on Sash.
These are new, aren't they? But I thought we were going to stop kidnapping ponies.
She nodded hesitantly.
Yes, but the foragers saw these guys nosing around near one of the entrances yesterday. Anther said the plan was to stay out of sight and wait for them to leave, but then they actually found the tunnel.
Oh, great, Caramel groaned.
No kidding,
Sash agreed.
The foragers jumped on them. I guess they thought it'd be better than letting them get away and risk telling somepony.
Sighing, Caramel turned his attention to the 2 captives. They were both Pegasus stallions, probably amongst the biggest he'd ever seen. They looked starved, though. Their ribs were showing, their feathers were crooked, and their coats bore the grime and ruggedness of hard travel. If they were in healthy condition, though, he suspected they would have almost rivaled Big Mac in weight. The green coloration of the pod was distorting their colors, but he surmised that one stallion was probably orange or brown with a darker shade for his mane. The other might have been dark green or gray with reddish hair. Both had various working tools for cutie marks. Green light in the corner of his eyes interrupted his musings, and he turned and found Sash with her horn aglow, staring intently at the Pegasi.
Hey, wait!
He exclaimed. Sash stopped immediately and looked at him in surprise.
What's the matter?
What are you doing? They don't look like they're in any condition to be fed on.
Oh, that.
Sash shrugged.
They're sleeping. It shouldn't affect their emotions too badly.
Caramel frowned.
Are you sure? Would there even be anything worthwhile? Because I don't think I'm going to be all that happy or lovey if I looked like that.
He pointed to one of the emaciated stallions in emphasis.
That's what Scorn wanted me to find out.
Sash gave him a reassuring smile.
Harvesting their love won't hurt them, and I'll leave them alone if I find they're emotionally drained already. This is pretty much standard procedure for us.
Okay. If you're sure they'll be fine.
Caramel retreated a few steps and watched as Sash closed her eyes and sent a tendril of magic from her horn, reaching towards one of the pods. After a minute or so, he sat on his haunches and took to observing what the rest of HunterCast were doing. Though the work cycle was coming to an end, there were a few others still harvesting love, along with several workers meticulously cleaning the pods and their surroundings. Another minute passed. Then two. This was taking longer than he'd expected. Maybe Sash had found the stallion suitable for harvesting after all. But it was odd that she'd hop straight to harvesting without first checking on the other guy.
She knows what she's doing.
Caramel mentally shrugged and went back to watching the others at their work. A sudden gasp brought his attention crashing back to Sash. He leaped to his hooves when he saw that she was trembling where she stood.
Are you okay?
He was about to put a hoof on her shoulder, but hesitated at the last second. He had no idea if it was safe to interrupt a changeling in the middle of harvesting love.
Hey, a little help over here, please!
He yelled. Several changelings turned his way, but only one actually came rushing over.
What is it?
She asked irritably.
This.
He gestured towards Sash.
This doesn't look normal. What's happening to her?
The changeling peered at her curiously. A second later, her expression grew worried.
I don't know. What was she trying to do?
She said she was going to check on these two. She wanted to see if they can be fed on. Does it usually take this long?
She shook her head.
It never does. Something's wrong. Give me a moment.
Caramel waited impatiently as the changeling focused on Sash, lit up her horn, and slipped into a meditative state. Seconds later, both Sash's and the newcomer's breathing grew heavy and irregular.
Oh, hayseed!
Sash suddenly collapsed to the ground, whimpering. The other soon followed. Caramel rushed to her side and shook her, no longer caring about the risk. It looked like she was having a nightmare or something. When she did not wake, he leaned in closer and whispered urgently,
Come on, I know you can hear me. Wake up!
Her eyes opened, but she didn't seem to see him. She whimpered and curled into a shivering ball, completely deaf to his pleas. The other changeling was faring no better.
What the heck is going on? What could have...
Caramel blinked. Slowly, he looked up and stared at the two stallions floating in the pods above them. Was it possible for ponies to fight backwash like that? He'd never heard of it before, and he was pretty sure something that important would have been mentioned. Sash murmured something unintelligible, but it was unmistakably out of fear. He tried speaking to her again, but she didn't give any sign of having heard him, not even when he shook her a little. Then, she started sobbing, and he growled in frustration. He could taste her fear and desperation. They were washing over him in waves. Glaring at the two stallions, he thought,
That's it. I'm coming in. And if you're the ones hurting her...
His horn was still recovering after being broken, and the new layer of chitin had only just begun to harden, but that was all he needed. Any other day, the thrumming sort of pain as he channeled his magic would have been too much to bear, but Sash's whimpers of terror spurred him onward. He plunged into the stallion's subconscious like a cannonball. The place that he entered was quiet. It was a vast expanse of darkness with the ground only dimly visible. This can't be right. Caramel didn't consider himself an expert on dream stalking, but he was certain that it wasn't supposed to be so barren and expansive. And dark. His vision was limited to a patch of ground going 100 paces in any direction, and it had about the same lighting as a deep cave. The swirling masses of clouds that were supposed to be the emotions and memories of the dreamer were still present, but they were dispersed. Where Lucky's had been thick and clumped together, these were long, thin, and fragmented. He focused on a relatively bright patch and glimpsed a little orange colt happily running around what looked like an old-style forge. He suppressed the urge to feed, reminding himself that there were more important things to worry about. Sash seemed to be in the grip of a terrible nightmare, one that she couldn't wake up from, and Caramel froze.
Nightmare. Oh no.
A deep growl shattered his train of thought. He tried to pull out of the stallion's subconscious, only to find himself back in the dark, cavernous space. Except that this time, it wasn't quite as dark. A pair of teal, glowing eyes were watching him. They had slit pupils like a cat's, and although he could not see what they belonged to, it was already very clear that it wasn't a pony. And Caramel didn't want to find out. He whirled around to beat a hasty retreat. Or rather, he tried to. His hooves felt like they were rooted to the ground. At the same time, the creature started moving towards him. Judging by the way the ground shook, it must have been massive. Before it had moved, the distance had simply given him a false impression of its real size.
Move! Move! Move!
He mentally screamed at himself.
Why can't I move?
He looked down and gasped when he saw that his hooves were rooted to the ground. Literally. Right where his fetlocks should be, the black chitin had given way to gnarly bark, and when he tugged hard, the earth gave way a little to reveal wiry roots stuck firmly in the ground. Another growl distracted him, and when Caramel looked back up, he saw the creature step into the dim light. Lines, curves, and shadows coalesced around the fierce pair of eyes until they formed a massive, angular head with thick horns, sharp spines, long snout, and smoking nostrils. 2 huge forelegs with wicked claws followed. Blue scales so dark that they were almost black glinted in the light.
Dragon!
Caramel made a sound that wasn't that far off from a squeak and ripped one hoof out of the ground, creating a fountain of dirt and snapped rootlets. He quickly did the same for the others and galloped as fast as he could. Unfortunately, having roots for hooves made running terribly difficult. He'd gone no further than a few yards before his legs got tangled in the ropey mess, and he soon ended up on the ground, ensnared and unable to get up. He cringed when he heard the pounding of the dragon's approach and desperately flailed his legs in an attempt to break the tangled roots. There was no such luck. Caramel cringed and curled up when the dragon was upon him, praying that maybe, just maybe, the dragon wasn't actually after him, or would just leave him alone if he pretended to be small and insignificant. Again, no such luck. He stiffened when he felt its clawed fingers close around him, then cried out when it lifted him into the air. His legs, roots and all, were pinned to his sides, and he was held before the dragon's terrible muzzle like some celery stalk that was about to be eaten. The dragon regarded him coldly for a moment, and then it roared in his face. The hot blast of air rippled with force, reverberating through every bone in his body. He snapped his eyes shut and whimpered as the dragon's claws tightened around him. There were other voices screaming in the darkness, but he couldn't hear them. They didn't matter anymore. The world had shrunk to just the little space that he had left in the dragon's crushing grip. He was completely helpless, and a little squeeze was all the dragon needed to pop him like a grape. Caramel started crying.
Please! I don't want to die!
He wailed between sobs. The dragon suddenly grew silent, and its grip loosened a little.
It's you!
The dragon said in a feminine voice. A feminine, pony-sized voice that was tinged with surprise.
What?
Caramel blinked and stared at the dragon. All at once, she didn't seem quite so scary anymore. The screaming in the background had stopped, the darkness had receded, and he actually recognized the dragon.
Princess Luna?
The dragon's claws went slack, and he gasped as he plummeted to the ground, flailing wildly. The hard rock rushed up to meet his face. Caramel was lying flat on the ground next to Sassaflash. Then he remembered what had happened when he tried dream-stalking the stallions, so he quickly sat up and patted her gently. She blinked and her eyes darted around for a moment, but they eventually focused on him, and she sighed and curled up tightly. She was still shivering, but at least she had woken up from the nightmare. He couldn't blame her. His heart was still pounding. He glanced around and was about to call for help when he noticed that the other changelings who had been feeding had all toppled over and were also curled up on the ground in catatonic terror. Most of them were trembling and making incoherent noises. Only a couple of them, most likely bystanders, were unaffected, and they were busy tending to the afflicted ones. None of them seemed to know what had happened. Caramel heard a gurgling sound at the same time movement above caught his eye. He looked up and froze when he saw one of the stallions looking directly at him. The other guy wasn't, but he appeared to be taking stock of his surroundings even as he floated in his pod. Those alone should have been reasons enough for Caramel to sound the alarm, but he couldn't help wondering what the starving Pegasi were going to do next. He imagined that waking up floating inside one of those horrible things would have been a panic-inducing experience, and yet they seemed almost accepting. Was it because they had already resigned themselves to such a fate? They certainly looked like they were only minutes away from passing out from hunger. Then, both stallions pressed a hoof against the side of the pod and dragged it across the inside surface. A thin line appeared in the wake of each swipe.
What are they?
The pods bulged at the lines. Caramel felt his eyes widen when the stallions repeated the move in the opposite direction. They looked like they had something sharp hammered into the underside of their hooves.
Oh, crud!
Caramel grabbed Sash and leaped back as the two pods split open, dumping their contents onto where he and she had been only seconds before. The stallions landed with heavy, wet splats, but they were on their hooves almost in an instant. Caramel watched, torn between apprehension and curiosity as the pair threw up green slime. He then winced when he heard the gurgling noises they made when they drew breath, coughing up more of the fluid they had breathed in. But the moment lasted only a few seconds, after which both stallions turned their attention to him. He took a step back. That should not have been possible. To regular ponies, the Hive might as well have been in total darkness, but these two were clearly looking at him.
Caramel?
Sash murmured, rubbing her head.
What was that? Oh, Takak!
She scrambled up and turned away to call for help, but at the same time one of the stallions, the orange one, swore under his breath and surged forward to tackle her. He slammed into her and covered her mouth, muffling her cry of alarm.
Hey!
Before he'd realized it, Caramel had already bared his fangs, leaped to her side, and slammed a hoof into the side of the stallion's head. The slime-covered Pegasus grunted and released her, but recovered quickly and glared at him. Caramel widened his stance, preparing to fend off an attack or intercept him if he tried to stop Sash from getting away, but something heavy slammed into his side and bowled him over. He tumbled and grappled with his assailant, realizing that it was the other stallion. The green-coated guy ended up pinning him to the ground, and Caramel was startled by just how heavy he was. He managed to get one hind leg under the stallion and kicked, but the big Pegasus only grunted and then whacked his head with a hoof. Stars danced before his eyes. He heard some scuffling nearby, then saw a green blast of magic flying straight at his assailant. The stallion spread his wings and leaped into the air to avoid it, and Caramel took the opportunity to get back onto his hooves. Sash was fighting the orange-coated Pegasus, alternating between taking swipes at him and blasting him with magic. The guy was able to block or avoid most of her attacks, but she did graze him a couple of times on the flank. Caramel dashed forward to tackle him, but he had apparently anticipated the attack and whirled round to deliver an uppercut with his wing.
Ah!
Caramel felt his neck crick as the world flipped upside down. He landed on his back and grimaced when his wings got scraped, And whilst Sash moved close and stood over him protectively, he saw the orange Pegasus turning tail to retreat to a safe distance. His companion darted over to his side soon after.
Hasty, those guys are strong.
Sash kept her horn flared up, panting heavily.
You okay?
Caramel asked as he got back up.
Fine.
She replied briskly.
What now?
It had to be some kind of trick. There was no way any pony who looked that starved could move so quickly and hit so hard. His jaw was starting to ache from the blow he'd received. He glared at the Pegasi and growled,
Who the heck are you guys?
They blinked, incomprehension written on their faces.
Oh, right.
He'd accidentally spoken in Vespid. But before he could rephrase his words in Equestrian, he heard the rapid pounding of hooves and buzzing of wings coming from behind. The others had finally taken notice. Realizing that they were outnumbered, the two Pegasi whirled round and fled down one of the tunnels leading towards the fungus farms. The pain that Caramel was feeling subsided to a mild throb when the others swarmed past him and down the tunnel, and he felt his heart rate climb steadily to a rapid drumming. He was suddenly itching for a fight, and he realized that he was under the effects of the combat pheromones. Chrysalis was coming.
What happened?
A voice asked urgently. Caramel turned and saw Scritch land next to him.
The two guys we brought in yesterday, they broke out,
Sash explained. Scritch turned his gaze to the members of Hunter Caste who were still curled up on the ground and shivering. With a puzzled frown, the warrior asked,
What's up with them? Nightmares,
Caramel stated.
What? Oh no.
Caramel turned to the tunnel and broke into a gallop after the two stallions. He had a suspicion that Princess Luna was up to something, but he couldn't be sure until he spoke to those two. He had no idea how he was supposed to accomplish that without having the entirety of Warrior Caste as an audience, but he would cross that bridge when he came to it.
Come on!
He yelled over his back.
I'll explain later!
The two Pegasi had caused quite a stir. Judging by the thunderous pounding of hooves, buzzing of wings, and raucous skittering, they might have had 50 changelings hot on their tails and spoiling for a fight. Caramel had to fight to keep his thoughts clear. The last thing he needed was to get into another scuffle with the Pegasi. But even the possibility of Princess Luna's involvement wasn't making it easy for him. Those guys had hurt him and Sassaflash, and he definitely couldn't let them get away without dishing back something in return for their troubles. Maybe a black eye or two.
Stop that! We're not supposed to be fighting!
Caramel, what are you up to?
Asked Sash as she galloped alongside him. She was clearly trying to resist the pheromones too, and her voice was a welcome distraction from the urge to fight.
Let me deal with them. I think Princess Luna knows where we are.
Sash's eyes bulged in surprise.
You mean she's the reason?
Think so. I'll sort it out.
They stopped talking after that and concentrated on catching up with the escaped prisoners.
Oh, wow.
They found the two stallions cornered in one of the fungus chambers, surrounded by nearly 20 changelings who were on the ground, clinging to the ceiling or hovering in the limited airspace. There was nowhere for them to go, though that didn't seem to be bothering them. Caramel's jaw went slack as the stallions whirled and danced in their little space, bucking, buffeting, and pounding anyone who dared to get within range. The rest of his former castmates were flitting in and out of the frenzy, but he could see 6 or 7 of them lying on the ground in various states of consciousness. There was an occasional flash of green when someone used magic, but because of the confines of that corner of the chamber and their frenzied battle, they were more likely to hit their siblings than the Pegasi. He could barely see the stallions in there. He toyed with the idea of charging in to have a bit of fun, but he shook his head violently to get rid of the pheromone-induced thought.
Guys, I think you should stop,
he said loudly. No one listened. His jaw dropped again when the green stallion rammed into a group and sent 4 warriors flying. But the big Pegasus was bleeding in several places, and there was a lot of sticky resin around his hooves. It was only a matter of time before they got beaten. It was taking awfully long to reach that point, though.
Ugh, guys, quit it!
A couple of his siblings glanced at him, but quickly went back to fighting. Caramel growled. If they didn't stop now, it would never end. He had not come all this way to see one skirmish ruin everything that he had fought for.
Just stop already!
He roared. Everyone froze and all eyes turned to him. Or most of them, rather. He felt bad for compelling the 3 changelings grappling with the Pegasi to let their guard down, since the 2 apparently had no qualms about taking advantage of their indecision. Caramel cringed when he heard the crack of their hooves on chitin and winced when his siblings crashed to the ground. But that was the last thing those stallions were getting for free. He brushed past his siblings, motioning for them to help up those that had been knocked out by the former captives. They did as he instructed, and when he reached the middle of the half-circle the changelings had formed around the Pegasi, he settled into what he hoped was a non-threatening posture. The Pegasi remained poised for battle, but he could see that they'd been worn down by the others. They were bleeding from cuts and had burn marks here and there, and globs of resin clung to their grimy coats and manes.
Relax. I don't want to hurt you guys,
he said in Equestrian. The orange Pegasus grinned at him with bloody teeth and spat onto the ground.
Oh, yes. My loose tooth can certainly attest to that.
Caramel blinked. Of all the attitudes that the stallions could have displayed in their situation, sarcasm was the least he would have expected. That tone certainly wasn't mollifying his siblings if their low, angry buzzing was any indication. Ignoring the snide remark, he said,
Okay, just calm down. Maybe we can... Very kind of you to provide the bruises, too,
the orange guy interjected.
Hey, you were the one who started it,
Sash snapped. Her anger was met with a wry grin.
Need I remind you that we were simply minding our business before you louts pounced on us like wolves? Your hospitality would put a diamond dog to shame.
Caramel felt his temper rising, and the pheromones certainly weren't helping. The others were bristling at the stallion's snarky attitude, but he brushed aside his growing irritation and waved his hoof repeatedly in a placating motion.
Never mind. Can we all just get along without fighting for a few minutes? Oh, you mean like them?
The orange stallion gestured at the changelings they'd knocked out. Someone hissed angrily.
You want to find out what fighting is like? Say that again. I dare you.
More angry hisses and chitters of agreement followed.
This is getting out of hoof.
Caramel considered shouting again to get everyone back into order, but he was spared from resorting to that when Chrysalis herself came trotting into the chamber. Everyone hushed at once and made way for her.
Oh, great.
This was going to complicate things. After glancing at her incapacitated children, the queen waved impatiently at those standing closest to them and said,
You, get them out of here. I'll deal with these troublemakers myself.
She then turned to the 2 stallions and gave them a nasty smile.
Interesting. You can see in the dark. And it's been quite a while since somepony managed to get out of the pod, let alone fight off a whole squad of my warriors. The fact that you did so while starving makes it all the more... impressive.
The orange Pegasus raised an eyebrow.
Who are you?
Don't you know? I'm Queen of the Changelings, the one who defeated your precious Princess Celestia in single combat.
Chrysalis chuckled.
Or has she been telling you ponies a different story to cover that up?
Ah, you mean the one where you and your army got catapulted out of Canterlot by a pair of love-struck ponies?
Chrysalis's smile disappeared.
Choose your words carefully. You are in my domain now. I still have more than enough power to flatten you.
The orange stallion leaned over to his companion and murmured,
I expected someone taller. Perhaps the princess was exaggerating after all.
The other guy shrugged.
I'm standing right here,
Chrysalis snapped. Her horn glowed and she bared her fangs.
Do you have a death wish, little pony?
She then turned to his partner and growled,
And what about you? Do you have anything to say for yourself?
The green stallion, who hadn't said a word up until then, shrugged again and said, Don't drag me into your quarrel. I insulted no pony.
Mr. Orange blinked at him in surprise. But didn't you call her a... He was cut off by a quick wing slap to the muzzle, after which Mr. Green repeated,
I insulted no pony.
Rubbing his muzzle tenderly, Orange muttered, What a friend you are!
At least you have one. I'm not dying for your loose tongue.
Caramel had been watching the exchange slack-jawed.
What's wrong with these guys?
Did the green slime in the pods make ponies suicidal or something? Chrysalis's eye twitched.
That's it.
Both stallions were engulfed in green auras and lifted into the air.
I did not come here to be insulted by you miserable bags of bones.
If it is any consolation, you hardly needed our help to... Ah! The queen slammed the orange stallion into the wall behind him. She then glanced at the green guy, then shrugged and did the same to him.
I was going to just put you back to sleep, but now that you've annoyed me, I think that can wait,
she growled. Caramel winced as her horn glowed brighter, and the two stallions started squirming and groaning. He'd been on the receiving end of her crushing grip before, and it wasn't something he would wish on any pony else.
Your Highness, maybe you could go a little easier on them?
He began, but the rest of his words refused to come out when Chrysalis scowled at him.
Your Highness!
A changeling came running into the chamber.
I'm busy. It can wait. But there's a... Be quiet. I'll be done in a minute.
Chrysalis snapped.
I just need to teach these smart mouths a lesson.
Though the stallions were obviously in pain, their refusal to break eye contact with the queen told Caramel that they were quite unrepentant.
Come on, just say you're sorry.
After a moment of watching them squirm, Chrysalis frowned and levitated them closer.
There's something odd about you after all. I had been wondering,
she murmured. The green guy tried to take a swipe at her with his hoof, but Chrysalis had already learned from Caramel when he'd tried the same move 2 days ago. She jerked her head back to avoid the punch and slammed him on the ground for good measure. Then she shot 2 streams of magic directly at them. The stallions were swallowed by green flames. There were gasps, chitters, and other sounds of surprise when the flames dissipated.
Well, that explains a lot.
They had been wearing magical disguises. Instead of starving ponies, Caramel found himself staring at 2 very fit, although injured, stallions in their prime. But that wasn't the most unusual thing about them. They had bat-like wings, ashen gray coats, dark purple manes and tails, extra tufty ears, and yellow eyes with slit pupils. Princess Luna's guards. He'd seen them during Nightmare Night, but he'd always assumed that they had just been dressing up for that event. If Chrysalis had stripped away their disguises with her magic, that would mean they really looked like that.
I thought those were just costumes,
Sash said. Chrysalis's frown deepened as she peered at them.
What are you?
The formerly orange Pegasus grinned, revealing a pair of fangs that were almost as long as a changeling's.
Single? You would not believe how many times a mare has turned away from me. Your endless babbling would account for half of that alone, his companion groused. At least I try. You, on the other hoof...
Shut up, both of you!
Chrysalis hissed.
I have never seen such...
Her words trailed off as a realization struck her. She whirled around to the changeling that had previously attempted to give her a message, who was fidgeting where he stood.
You! What were you trying to tell me earlier?
Probably...
Ah!
Without even bothering to look, Chrysalis had silenced the bat pony by squeezing his throat with her magic. He gasped and flailed, but she held him tight.
It's the princess! She's taking away the pods! We couldn't stop her!
Chrysalis's eyes widened.
What? Celestia is here? No, it's the blue one!
If Caramel's brain had gears in it, they would have ground to a halt.
She's here? But that would mean she's after... But how... Oh, Hasty, what do I do?
The queen blinked, glanced at the bat ponies, then looked past the nervous messenger and stared up the tunnel to the captive chamber.
Oh, clever girl.
She sneered at the two stallions and blasted them with two concussive bursts of magic, one after the other, hard enough to smash them against the wall and leave them in crumpled heaps on the ground.
Lock them up in the holding cell. Use the chains.
Chrysalis spun round as the others descended on the stallions, and Caramel heard her murmur,
So the little sister dabbles in transfiguration.
just before she galloped up the tunnel. Caramel lingered for a moment, but when his brain failed to come up with a plan to deal with the situation, he decided to wing it and galloped after the queen, along with Sash and those who were not tasked with restraining Princess Luna's guards. No wonder they had been acting so strangely. They had been stalling for time. They entered the repository just in time to see a dark blue alicorn slicing one of the pods away from the ceiling with her magic. There were nearly a dozen changelings strewn about the place, and most of them were either curled up and cowering in place or groaning in pain. By her hooves were several pods with their occupants still asleep. Caramel counted the number of severed stalks hanging from the ceiling around the place and estimated that she had probably freed half of the captives already.
But where are the rest of them?
I hope we're not interrupting anything.
Chrysalis politely quipped. The Moon Princess tensed when she saw them. Then her horn glowed and the air around her began to shimmer along with the pods lying at her hooves. Chrysalis growled,
I have captured both of your goons. Teleport out and I will have them executed.
The princess's determined expression wavered, revealing uncertainty for a moment, but she did end her spell. As she gently lowered the severed pods, more changelings poured into the chamber and surrounded her, though their gingerly slow advance made it clear just how little they wanted to mess with her, seeing as she had already incapacitated a fair number of them. Everyone kept at least a dozen paces between them and the princess. Princess Luna, on the other hoof, didn't seem to mind being surrounded. She gave Chrysalis an appraising look, then said,
Resorting to honorless threats so soon? Perhaps my sister's low opinion of you was correct after all.
Oh, look who's talking. You're trespassing and stealing our food. I'll do what it takes to protect my children.
Chrysalis retorted coolly.
They are not food,
Princess Luna growled.
and you have no right to keep them here against their will.
Would you throw one of my subjects in a dungeon if it meant saving the life of one of your own?
Luna frowned, but she did not give an answer. Chrysalis smirked.
I thought so. Now surrender, and maybe I'll consider letting you go with a warning.
The Moon Princess remained silent.
Come on, don't take all day.
Chrysalis faked a lazy yawn.
There's no need to feel bad about it. Plans fall apart sometimes. Trust me on this. You've already spent all your luck just finding the Hive.
Caramel had been standing in the throng of guards and warriors behind Chrysalis the whole time, but it was at that moment that Princess Luna's eyes flicked over to him. He was sure that her eyes had fallen on him for only a fraction of a second, but Chrysalis had apparently noticed it, for she turned in surprise and swept her gaze over everyone. She too focused on him for a second, then shot a look back at the princess, who was watching intently.
Caramel,
Chrysalis asked in a dangerously sweet voice.
did you know something about this?
She waved a hoof at Luna and the severed pods. Could he say that he hadn't known? Well, he hadn't. Not really. But after all those weird dreams and odd little things that he did, he remembered seeing a shadow on the moon when he climbed to the surface. Would she blame him? He started sweating when he realized that everyone was looking at him. The smart thing to do would be to deny it first. He could get all that sorted out later. He opened his mouth, but the only thing that came out was... Her eyes narrowed.
We're going to have a long, long chat after this.
She then turned back to the princess and said,
I've changed my mind. Surrender now and maybe I'll keep the ransom at a reasonable amount.
It was Princess Luna's turn to frown. She was hesitating, torn between two decisions that she did not want to make, that much he could tell. She glanced down at one of the sleeping ponies in the pods, then back at Chrysalis, and there was a flicker of anguish on her face. Then, the princess grabbed the loose pods with her magic and quickly shifted them out of the way. At the same time, she flared her wings, took a step forward, and snorted.
If you want my surrender, you will have to earn it.
The queen lifted an eyebrow.
Really? I still have your guards. Stop this nonsense or they're going to suffer for it. Would you sacrifice 2 of your subjects to save more than 10 times as many?
Luna pawed at the ground and rumbled,
But know this. If you harm my subjects, I will exact vengeance for their suffering. In blood, if necessary. Don't be stupid.
Chrysalis gestured towards the changelings around the princess.
You are completely surrounded and outnumbered.
Luna was unperturbed. After surveying everyone present, she gave a mirthless chuckle.
Well, that is hardly fair. You should have brought thrice as many soldiers.
Your Highnesses?
Caramel raised his hoof gingerly.
Maybe we should...
Both shot glares at him that were fit to freeze water, and his voice died off. It was over. He'd blown it. He'd lost Chrysalis's trust, and it was obvious now that Princess Luna had other plans of her own.
I'll get the injured out of here,
Sash whispered.
See what you can do about getting them to stop.
Caramel nodded as she hustled a couple of other changelings to drag Luna's victims to safety. This was going to get ugly.
I defeated your elder sister, little princess. Do you really think you can do better than her?
Luna's only response was to light up her horn with blue magic. Chrysalis sighed.
Fine, seize her!